All right, guys, we're on chapter 4 of Thomas Mann's Death in Venice. Death in Venice. About 13 pages, so I think we'll be able to finish it. Actually, let me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Yeah, 13. So it might be about 30-minute video. So, chapter 4, Thomas Mann, Death in Venice. Now, day after day, the naked god with the flaming cheeks drove his team of 4 fire-breathing horses through the expanses of heaven, and his yellow curls fluttered in the east wind that came blasting out at the same time. A whitish silken shimmer covered the vastness of sluggishly rolling pontos. The sand burned under the flickering silvery blue of the ether. A rusty red canvas stretched outside each cabana, and vacationers spent their morning hours in the sharply outlined shade created by the awning. However, the evening could also be delicious when the plants in the park gave off a balmy fragrance. The constellations danced their rounds overhead, and the murmurs of the night-shrouded sea rose up softly, bewitching the soul. An evening like that could joyfully guarantee another sunny day of casually arranged idleness, densely adorned with countless charming and random possibilities. The guest detained here by so convenient a mishap was far from viewing the recovery of his trunk as a reason for another departure. For 2 days he had been forced to put up with a few deprivations and don a travel suit for his meals in the main dining room. Then when the stray freight was finally deposited in his room, he unpacked everything, filling the wardrobe and the drawers with his belongings, resolved as he was to stay on indefinitely, delighted that he could now spend his beach hours in a silk suit and wear the appropriate evening garb when showing up for dinner at his small table. The pleasant monotony of his existence had already cast its spell on him. The soft and glossy mildness of this lifestyle had quickly beguiled him. And what a wonderful place it was, combining the charms of cultivated living on a South European beach with the familiar nearness of a wondrous and wonderful city. Aschenbach was no lover of pleasure. Whenever and wherever he began to skylark, to have fun, to enjoy himself, especially in his younger years, he soon felt restless and reluctant and longed to go back to the sublime toil, the holy and austere service of his normal agenda. Venice was the only place that could enchant him, relax his willpower, make him happy. He might be sitting under his cabana awning after breakfast, dreaming into the blueness of the southern sea, or on a lukewarm night, after lingering a while on Piazza San Marco, he might be leaning against the cushions in a gondola under the vast and starry sky, gliding homeward to the Lido, with the colorful lights, the poignant strains of the serenade fading behind him. And sometimes he would think of his mountain cottage, his struggles during the summer there, with the clouds drifting low through the garden, dreadful evening storms blowing the lights out in the cottage, and the ravens, fed by him, rocking in the crowns of the fir trees. He would then feel transported to the Elysian land, to the edges of the earth, where the easiest living is granted to human beings, where there is no snow and no winter, no storm and no downpour, but only the gently cooling breath of oceanos, and the days flow by in blissful leisure with no effort or conflict, devoted entirely to the sun and its festivities. Aschenbach saw the boy Tadzio, frequently, almost steadily, except for brief interruptions. The narrow confines and the uniform schedules of all these people kept the beautiful boy nearby throughout the day. He saw him, ran into him everywhere in the ground floor areas of the hotel, on the cool boat rides to and from the city, amid the splendor of the piazza itself, and in any number of other places if luck was with him. Chiefly, however, and with the most fortunate regularity, the mornings at the beach offered him lengthy opportunities to revere and scrutinize this sweet and lovely vision. Yes, this reliability of luck, this steady daily occurrence of favorable circumstances, were the very things that filled him with contentment and joy de vivre, that made his stay here so precious, that strung the sunny days so pleasantly together. He rose early as he normally did when driven by a throbbing urge to work, and he was one of the first on the beach when the sun was still mild and the sea lay dazzlingly white in its morning dreams. He benevolently greeted the watchman at the gate. He also familiarly greeted the barefooted, white-bearded oldster who had prepared his place, had set up the brown awning, and moved the chair and the table from the cabana to the platform, where Aschenbach then settled. 3 or 4 hours were now his, hours in which the sun rose to its zenith, gaining dreadful might, in which the sea turned a deeper and deeper blue, and in which he could gaze at Tadzio. He saw him coming from the left along the waterline, or saw him emerging in the back from between the cabins, or else he suddenly assumed, not without a certain joyful alarm, that he had missed the boy's arrival, that he was already here, already wearing the blue and white bathing suit that had become his sole garment on the beach. He feared that Tadzio was already immersed in his usual activities amid sun and sand, that charming idle, that unsteady and indolent life, playful and restful, that strolling, wading, digging, grabbing line, and swimming. The women watching him from the platform would shout for him, call his name in their high voices, Tadzio, Tadzio, and gesticulating at them, he would dash over to describe what he had experienced, to show them what he had found, had caught, mussels, seahorses, jellyfish, and sideways scuttling crabs. Aschenbach did not understand anything he said, but no matter how banal his words might be, they formed blurry harmonies in the listener's ears. Their foreignness transformed them into music. An exuberant sun poured lavish brilliance over him, and the sublime vastness of the sea constantly served as his foil and background. Soon the observer knew every line and pose of that body that presented itself so freely, so exaltedly. He joyously welcomed yet again every familiar trait of beauty, and there was no end to his admiration, to the tender delight of his senses. The boy might be summoned to say hello to a guest visiting the women at the cabin. Tadzio ran over, perhaps dripping wet from the sea. He tossed his curls, and holding out his hand, resting his weight on one leg, the other foot on tiptoe, he charmingly turned and twisted his body gracefully, in suspense, amiably bashful, anxious to please as an aristocratic obligation. Or he lay stretched out on the sand, his beach towel wrapped around his chest, his delicate chiseled arm propped on the ground, his chin on his high hand. The boy known as Yashu squatted by him, courting him, and nothing could be more enchanting than the smiling eyes and lips of the chosen one as he peered up at his subaltern, his servant. Or else, his hands clasped on the back of his neck, he might be standing by the water's edge, alone, aloof from his family, very near Aschenbach, erect, slowly rocking on the balls of his feet, dreaming into the blueness, while small waves lapped up and bathed his toes. His honey-colored curls snuggled against his temples and his neck. The sun illuminated the down on his upper spine. The fine lineation of the ribs, the symmetry of the chest emerged through the sheer skin on his torso. His armpits were still as smooth as a statue's. The hollows of his knees were shiny, and their bluish veins made his body look as if it were formed out of something more lucid than flesh. What breeding, what precision of thought were expressed in this elongated and youthfully perfect body, yet wasn't the strict and pure will that had labored in obscurity to thrust this godly sculpture into the light, wasn't it known and familiar to him, the artist? Didn't that will operate within him to when didn't that will operate within him too when, filled with sober passion, he worked on the marble mass of language and liberated the slender form that he had seen in spirit and that he presented to humanity as an idol and mirror of spiritual beauty? Idle and mirror, his eyes enfolded the noble figure there at the edge of the blue, and in sweeping, worshipful rapture, he believed that with his gaze he could grasp beauty itself, form as a divine thought, the one and pure perfection which lives in the mind and of which a human effigy and metaphor had been put up here, light and lovely, to be revered. This was frenzy, and the aging artist welcomed it with no qualms, indeed greedily. His mind was in labor, his cultural foundation was heaving and seething, his memory cast up ancient thoughts that had been handed down to him in his youth, and they had never until now been animated by his own fire. Was it not written that the sun diverts our attention from intellectual to sensual things? Supposedly, it so thoroughly benumbs and bewitches our reason and memory that the ecstatic soul completely forgets its own state of being, and with astonished admiration dotes on the most beautiful of these sunlit objects. In fact, it is only with the help of a body that the soul can then rise to a more sublime contemplation. It is only with the help of a body that the soul can then rise to a more sublime contemplation. Amor truly emulated the mathematicians who show tangible pictures of ideal forms to children still unable to think abstractly. The God of love did likewise when, to make the spiritual visible to us, he used the shape and color of human youth, adorning it with all the reflected luster of beauty as an instrument for the memory, and making us burn with pain and hope at the mere sight of it. Those were the enthusiast's thoughts, those were the things he could feel, and the intoxication of the sea and the brilliance of the sun wove into an enchanting tableau for him. There was the old plane tree not far from the walls of Athens. There was that holy and shady spot, fragrant with chaste tree blossoms and decorated with votive images and pious offerings in honor of the nymphs and Akelus. Very clear was the brook tumbling over smooth pebbles at the foot of the spreading tree. The crickets fiddled, but on the grassy bank which sloped down gently so that you could hold your head high, while reclining, two men were resting, shielded from the heat of the day. An elderly man and a young one, an ugly and beautiful one, the wise man with the engaging one. And with courteous words and astutely wooing jests, Socrates taught Phaedrus about desire and virtue. He spoke to him about the burning shock that the feeling person suffers when laying eyes on an image of eternal beauty. He spoke to him about the lust of the impious and evil man who cannot conceive of beauty upon seeing its effigy, and who is incapable of awe, spoke about the sacred terror that overcomes a noble person when he beholds a godlike countenance, a perfect body. Such a man shudders and is beside himself and scarcely dares to peep, and he reveres the bearer of beauty, would even sacrifice to him as to a statue if he did not fear being thought a madman. For beauty, my Phaedros, beauty alone is both lovely and visible at once. Beauty, mark my words, is the only form of the spiritual that we can receive with our senses, endure with our senses. What would become of us if godliness, if reason and virtue and truth were to appear to our senses? Would we not be devastated and devoured by the flames of love as Semele by Zeus so long ago? Thus beauty is the filling man's way to the spirit. Thus beauty is the filling man's way to the spirit. Beauty is the filling man's way to the spirit. I think that's why this is a classic. This is a short book. This what's being said right here is the reason why this book is so amazing, because he found a way to put into words what I've been trying. What would become of us if godliness, if reason and virtue and truth were to appear to our senses? We go mad. Would we not be devastated and devoured by the flames of love? Thus beauty is the filling man's way to the spirit. Only the way, only a means, little Phaedros. And then he uttered the very subtlest statement, the cunning wooer. He said that the lover is more divine than the beloved, because the God dwells in the one but not in the other. The tenderest, most sardonic thought perhaps that was ever thought, the wellspring of all the roguery and most secret voluptuousness of yearning. The artist finds delight in thinking that can become sheer feeling, and feeling that can become sheer thinking. The artist finds delight in thinking that can become sheer feeling, and feeling that can become sheer thinking. At this time, such pulsative thinking, such precise feeling belonged to, obeyed the solitary man who thought and felt that nature shudders with bliss when the spirit bows in homage to beauty. He had a sudden urge to write. Now, Eros, we are told, loves idleness, and that alone is why he was created. Yet at this point in the crisis, the stricken man's agitation focused on creativity. What prompted it scarcely mattered. A question, a challenge about a certain great and burning issue of culture and taste had been raised as revelation in the intellectual world, and the query had reached the traveler. He was familiar with the subject, he had experienced it, and all at once he could not resist a craving to make it glisten with his language. And he longed to work in Tadzio's presence, to model his writing after the boy's figure, to let his style follow the lines of that godly body and transform his beauty into the spiritual, the way the eagle once bore the Trojan shepherd to the ether. The way the eagle once bore the Trojan shepherd to the ether. Never had he felt the pleasure of words more sweetly. Never had he known so deeply that Eros is in words as in the dangerously delicious hour when he sat at his crude table under the awning, with his idol in full view, the music of that voice in his ears. He was modeling his little essay on Tadzio's beauty, forming that page in a half of exquisite prose whose purity, nobility, and quivering emotional tension would shortly gain the admiration of many. It is most certainly a good thing that the world knows only the beautiful opus, but not its origins, not the conditions of its creation. For if people knew the sources of the artist's inspiration, that knowledge would often confuse them, alarm them, and thereby destroy the effects of excellence. It's most certainly a good thing. Purpose, condition, and creation. Strange hours, strangely enervating labor, bizarrely fertile intercourse of the mind with the body. By the time Aschenbach put away his work and abandoned the beach, he was exhausted, even shattered, and he felt his conscience lamenting as if after a debauchery. It was on the following morning, when he was about to descend the outside stairs of the hotel, that he spotted Tadzio heading toward the beach all alone and already approaching the barrier gate. Aschenbach simply thought of using this opportunity to meet the boy who unknowingly aroused so much elation and emotion in him. He wished almost urgently to make his acquaintance casually and serenely, to address him, to delight in his response, his gaze. The beauty was sauntering, he could be overtaken, and Aschenbach quickened his steps. He caught up with him on the boardwalk behind the cabins. He wanted to put his hand on the youngster's head, on his shoulder, and some words or other, an amiable French phrase hovered on his lips. But then, perhaps partly because of his rapid stride, his heart was hammering. He was very short of breath, so that his voice would be quaking and strained. He hesitated. He tried to get hold of himself. He suddenly feared he had been trailing the beauty too long and too closely. He feared the boy would notice him, would look back quizzically. Aschenbach charged off faster, refrained, renounced, and lowering his head passed him by. Too late, he thought at that moment. Too late, but was it too late? The step he had failed to take might readily have led to something light, something good and glad, to salutary sobering, but perhaps the aging man did not want any sobering. His rapture may have been too precious. Who can decipher the nature and character of artistry? Who can grasp the profound instinctual merger of discipline and dissipation on which it is founded? For inability to desire salutary sobering is in itself dissipation. Aschenbach no longer had a mind for self-criticism. Given his taste and mental makeup at this point in his life, given his self-esteem, maturity, and late one simplicity, he did not care to dissect his motives and determine whether his failure to carry out his plan was due to weakness or slovenliness. He was confused. He feared that someone, if only the beach guard, might have observed his dash, his defeat. He dreaded looking ridiculous. Yet he kept joking to himself about the funny and holy anxiety that had held him back. Bewildered, he thought, bewildered like a frightened rooster that droops its wings in a fight. This is truly the work of the God who, when we behold beauty, breaks our spirit and drastically crushes our pride. He played with that idea, rhapsodized about it, and was much too arrogant to fear any feeling. He failed to notice the end of the period of idleness that he had granted himself. He didn't even think of going home. He had assigned himself ample funds. His sole worry was that the Polish family might leave, but he had deviously learned, by casually asking the hotel barber, that they had arrived very shortly before him. The sun tanned his face and hands. The exhilarating salt air increased his emotional power. Normally, whatever refreshment he gained from sleep, food, or nature had been promptly expended on some work. But now any daily strengthening by sun, sea air, and idleness was generously and inefficiently consumed in euphoria and sensation. His sleep was fitful. The exquisitely uniform days were separated by brief nights of happy disquiet. True, he would retire early, since the day seemed to end for him at 9 p.m., when Tadzio vanished from the scene, but at the crack of dawn, Aschenbach was awoken by a gently penetrating fear. His heart would recall his adventure. He could no longer stand being in bed. He got up and, lightly glad against the early morning chill, he sat down at the open window to wait for the rising of the sun. His soul, already consecrated by sleep, was filled with awe at that miraculous event. Sky, earth, and sea were still lying in the ghostly and glassy pallor of the day. A fading star was still floating in unreality. But then came a wafting, a wing tiding from inaccessible dwellings, the news that Eros was rising from her husband's side, and the farthest strips of sky and sea were tinged by the first sweet flush that heralds the sensory perception of creation. The goddess was approaching, the seductress of adolescence, she who carried off Cletos and Cephalos, and defying the envy of all the Olympians, enjoyed the love of the beautiful Orion. Roses were strewn at the edge of the earth, and ineffably lovely, shining and flowering, infant clouds, transfigured, illumined, were hovering like attendant cupids in the rosy and bluish haze. Purple radiance dropped on the sea, which surged and appeared to be heaving it forward. Golden spears flashed from below to the height of the heavens. The glistening became a burning, sounding soundlessly with divine violence. The glow and the blaze and the flaring flames billowed upward, and with snatching hooves the brothers' sacred steeds came galloping over the earth. Lit up by the god's splendor, the solitary waker sat there. He closed his eyes and let the magnificence kiss his lids. Long-lost feelings, early and precious sufferings of his heart, all of them having died in the severe servitude of his life, now returned strangely transformed. He recognized them with a confused and astonished smile. He mused, he dreamed, and slowly his lips shaped a name. And still smiling with his face turned up, his hands folded in his lap, he dozed off again in his chair. But the day which began so festive and fiery was mysteriously exalted, was metamorphosed as in a myth, or metamorphosed as in a myth. But the day which began so festive and fiery was mysteriously exalted, was metamorphosed as in a myth. Where did it start? From where did it come? The breath, suddenly so soft and significant that like a whispering from loftier realms played around his ears and temples. Hordes of white and wispy cloudlets were scattered widely across the sky like grazing herds owned by the gods. A stiffer wind arose, and Poseidon's horses came dashing and rearing, bulls perhaps that belonged to the one with the bluish curls, bulls that bellowed and charged with lowered horns. But between the rocks on the distant beach, the caves came hopping up as leaping goats, a world disfigured by holiness, exalted by the existence of Pan, enveloped the spellbound human, and his heart dreamed of delicate fables. Often, when the sun was sinking behind Venice, he would sit on a bench in the park watching Taggio, who, clad in white with a colored bout, was joyfully playing ball on the rolled gravel court. And it was Jacinth whom the viewer believed he saw, Jacinth who was doomed to die because he was loved by two gods. The viewer even felt Zephyr's painful jealousy of his rival, who forgot all about his bow, his oracle, and his cithara in order to play constantly with the beautiful youth. He saw the discus aimed by cruel jealousy and striking the lovely head, likewise turning pale. He received the buckled body, and the flower blossoming from the sweet blood bore the imprint of his endless lament. Nothing is more bizarre, more ticklish than a relationship between two people who know each other only with their eyes, who encounter and observe each other daily, even hourly, never greeting, never speaking, constrained by convention or by caprice to keep acting the indifferent strangers. They experience discomfort and overwrought curiosity, the hysteria of an unsatisfied, unnaturally stifled need to recognize and to exchange, and they especially feel something like a tense mutual esteem. For people love and honor someone so long as they cannot judge him, and yearning is a product of defective knowledge. I gotta highlight that. For 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 people love and honor someone, and so as long as they cannot judge him, and yearning is a product of defective knowledge. This is why I read, man, shit like this. Some kind of relationship of acquaintanceship was bound to develop between Aschenbach and the young Taggio, and the older man was deeply thrilled when he determined that his interest and attention were not entirely unrequited. What, for example, induced the beauty when he appeared on the beach in the morning to stop using the boardwalk behind the cabins and to walk only in front over the sand past Aschenbach's domicile, sometimes so unnecessarily close to the rider, almost brushing his table, his chair, as the boy sauntered toward his family's cabana? Was that how the attraction, the fascination of a superior feeling affected its tender and heedless object? Aschenbach looked forward every day to Tadzio's arrival, and sometimes he pretended to busy at that moment and to ignore the beauty strolling by, but at other times he did look up and their eyes met. They were both deeply earnest whenever that happened. Nothing in the elderly man's cultivated and dignified expression so much as hinted at any emotion, but Taggio's gaze was filled with questioning, with reflective wondering, and his feet faltered. He glanced at the ground. He charmingly glanced up again. And once he was past, a certain something in his posture appeared to be saying that only his upbringing kept him from turning his head. One evening, however, things changed. The Polish family and its chaperone failed to show up for dinner, as Aschenbach anxiously noticed. He was worried about them, and after the meal in evening attire and straw hat, he was strolling in front of the hotel at the bottom of the terrace when all at once he saw them emerging in the light of the arc lamps, the nun-like sisters with the governess, and 4 paces behind them Tadzio. They were clearly coming from the steamer pier after dining in town for some reason. It must have been cooler out on the water. Tadzio wore a dark blue peacoat with gold buttons and a matching cap. Sun and sea air never burned him. His skin had remained as yellowish as marble since the beginning, but tonight he seemed paler than usual, either because of the evening's coolness or because of the bleaching moonlight of the lamps. His symmetrical eyebrows stood out more sharply, his eyes darkened deeply. He was more beautiful than any words could say, and Aschenbach painfully felt, as so often before, that language can only praise but not reproduce the beauty that appeals to the senses. Language can only praise but not reproduce the beauty that appeals to the senses. He had not expected this precious appearance. It was unhoped for. He had no time to put on an expression of calm dignity. His face may have openly displayed his joy, surprise, admiration when his eyes encountered those of the person he had missed, and at that instant it happened. Taggio smiled at him, his lips slowly opened into an eloquent, intimate, charming, and candid smile. It was a smile of Narcissus leaning over the mirroring water, that deep, drawn-out, bewitching smile with which he stretched his arms toward the reflection of his own beauty, a very slightly distorted smile, distorted by the hopelessness of his striving to kiss the sweet lips of his image, coquettish, curious, and mildly tortured, beguiled, and beguiling. The man receiving the smile hurried away with it as much The man receiving the smile hurried away with it as with a fateful gift. He was so deeply shaken that he was forced to flee the light of the terrace, the front gardens, and he hastily sought the darkness of the park behind the hotel. Strangely indignant and affectionate exhortations were wrung from him. You mustn't smile like that. Listen, you mustn't smile at anyone like that. He flung himself on a bench. He was beside himself. He breathed the nocturnal fragrance of the plants, and leaning back with dangling arms, overwhelmed and shuddering again and again, he whispered the standard formula of desire. Impossible here, absurd, abject, ludicrous, and yet sacred and honorable even here. I love you. Hey guys, I read this because I heard of it before. Death in Venice. But it's kind of becoming a little weird, right? Got this old man into some young boy. I don't know if he's into him, if it's just like an artist into just the beauty of him, like objectively. It's like a innocent, harmless, like a fascination. You know, he's just an artist, so he's fascinated by beauty, you know, shit like that. But I guess we're gonna find out in the last chapter, which is gonna be in parts because it goes from 341 all the way to 366. So there's some gems in here, just the way, like, I don't know. There is some literary gems. It's the way he puts words together to paint certain emotion you may have had, not in a different form. You know, love is the form, and then you have the particulars, just the form of how to use words to describe a certain feeling you may have felt. That's the beauty of it. Anyway, that was chapter 4. Peace.